South Africa's attitude to Rwanda really baffling. It seems to me very limp, kind of almost sort of browbeaten, nervous, intimidated. And I'm constantly thinking, but South Africa is one of the most important countries on the continent, economically, strategically, diplomatically, militarily. It totally outstrips this tiny little country of 12 million people. And yet it seems to be living in fear of Paul Kagame. And you're constantly seeing articles in the South African press where they talk about, maybe it's going to be okay because Cyril Ramaphosa and Kagame, they're normalizing relations, because, of course, there was a period where the embassy, after multiple provocations, the ambassador was withdrawn and things became a bit strained. But my God, how many provocations did it need? One of the details that really fascinated me when I was researching this book was to discover that at a certain stage, because the government in Kigali was constantly giving the South Africans a hard time about why are you sheltering, why are you giving sort of safe haven to these political dissidents who we now regard as terrorists, the South Africans spent a lot of time and money researching a Caribbean option, which would have involved sending Patrick Karegeya and Kayumba and I don't know who else off to live in the Caribbean, so that they would have been rid of that particular source of friction, and South African taxpayers would have paid for that arrangement. And you kind of think, well, why on earth would you do that? Why don't you just tell Kigali that this is none of their business? So I find it very curious. I mean, during the inquest into Patrick Karegeya's murder, which was extremely poorly covered by the South African press. I mean, almost nobody turned up, which is interesting in itself. It was fascinating because there were all these revelations that came up in court that meant we could then report on them, the few journalists who were interested. And these included, for example, the fact that after Karegeya's murder, that the Hawks had drawn up a report and sent it in, and in fact briefed Parliament on it, saying there's no point going ahead with this because we know that this is there's the involvement of the Rwandan government, so there's no point sort of pressing for charges because we know who's involved and it would just be very awkward. So that was pretty amazing. Then we have 5 years of delay, which can never quite be explained, in which the court case, the inquest goes absolutely nowhere and is only revived when Harry now is taken on and uses all his clout and his contacts to get things moving again. And then finally, we get 2 arrest warrants issued for 2 Rwandans who, of course, have long flown the nest and are back in Rwanda. And the Rwandans have paid absolutely no heed to that and not sent these men, not extradited these men, as is completely predictable. But I just find it extraordinary. You get the sense of a South African foreign policy which is just doesn't know how to deal with this extremely macho, aggressive, bullying president who says what he thinks and sort of doesn't sort of bother with diplomatic niceties and just is sort of constantly perplexed and intimidated by Kagame. I do find it really curious. I mean, we will see what happens in the future.
Right, absolutely. I want to move on to some other questions that we have here. One is a very South African question, I think, which is that is it possible that there were bribes paid to the South African government to get it to be quiet about the truth around the assassination of Karegeya and the attempts on Kayumba?
That's an interesting question. I've heard speculation about bribes being paid in the trial of Kayumba Nyamwasa, which came up with a very politically convenient finding in which the men who would undoubtedly have been able to establish a really strong link between the attempted assassination of Kayumba Nyamwasa and Kigali, they were allowed to go free and therefore immediately left the country. And I've heard speculation about that bribes were involved in that case, but that kind of thing's always impossible to prove. I hadn't thought of that allegation. I think it's doubtful because the Hawks, for example, the briefing I talked about, it would have involved far too many MPs. I think it's more about a sort of South African, almost a sense of embarrassment that the South African Foreign Ministry and sort of executive just doesn't know how to deal with a movement and a leader that is so nakedly direct in what it's willing to do to take out its enemies, that it's almost sort of embarrassed for Rwanda, and therefore it sort of takes on itself the embarrassment, whereas it's always seemed to me obvious that the embarrassment should all be on the Kigali side of things.